The morning began with the kind of silence that only comes before the city truly wakes up. The sky was still a pale shade of gray, the sun struggling to rise above the horizon, and the streets lay mostly empty. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, softening the sharp edges of the world. The sound of tires on asphalt carried more clearly than usual in the still air, and the occasional honk of a distant horn seemed almost out of place. Marcus Reynolds drove his black sedan calmly, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his posture straight, his gaze steady. Everything about him spoke of a man who carried himself with discipline and quiet authority. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his tie knotted neatly at his throat, and the faint gleam of a watch peeked out from under his cuff. He had been up since 5, as always, beginning his day with a jog, then breakfast, then reviewing his notes before heading into work. He was a man of structure, a man who had built his life on principles of self-control and measured action. But to Officer Daniels, watching from his cruiser parked a block away, none of that mattered. Daniels sat hunched over the steering wheel, his coffee cooling in the cup holder, his mood foul from another night shift that had bled into morning. His eyes narrowed as the black sedan passed by, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights. He didn't see the discipline in Marcus's posture or the quiet authority in his expression. He didn't notice the way the car was driven carefully, within the speed limit, signaling at every turn. What Daniel saw first, what he always saw first, was skin color. The thought came quickly, a prejudice that had long since rooted itself in him. That guy doesn't belong here. The neighborhood was wealthier than most parts of the city. Large homes stood behind wrought iron gates, manicured lawns stretched wide. The sidewalks were empty, save for the occasional jogger. Daniels convinced himself that the sedan was suspicious. It didn't matter that there was no crime, no infraction, no broken law. To him, Marcus's very presence felt like a challenge. His grip tightened around the wheel, his jaw set, and with a flick of his wrist, he switched on his sirens. The sound pierced the morning air, startling birds from the trees. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, his brows knitting slightly. The lights reflected off the glass, red and blue, spinning across his calm features. He sighed quietly, guiding his car to the curb, his movements controlled. It wasn't the first time this had happened to him, though it never grew easier. Daniels stepped out of his cruiser with exaggerated authority, one hand already resting near his holster. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and walked. With the swagger of someone who wanted to be seen, who wanted to show control, Marcus rolled down his window and waited, his face unreadable. License and registration, Daniels barked without greeting, his tone sharp-clipped, designed to assert power. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Of course, officer," he said, his voice calm, deep, even. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Daniels narrowed his eyes. "That's not your concern. I said license and registration." Now, there was no reason for the stop, and both men knew it. Marcus had done nothing wrong, but Daniels was counting on intimidation to silence any questions. He thrived on the small victories of making people obey simply because he told them to. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't argue. Steady hands, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, retrieving his license. From the glove box, he collected the registration. He handed them over with a quiet dignity that only seemed to annoy Daniels more. Daniels looked at the documents as though he expected them to be fake, his lip curling into a sneer. "You know, guys like you don't usually drive cars like this," he said, circling the vehicle with slow, deliberate steps. His words dripped with something ugly, something meant to sting. Marcus sat still, his eyes following Daniels in the mirror. He had heard such insinuations before. He had lived with them for years. It never got easier to endure, but he had learned to meet them with silence, not because he accepted them, but because he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing his anger. Daniels tapped the roof of the car with his palm as he circled back to the driver's side. "You sure this is yours?" Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "Yes, officer. The papers are in your hand." The sarcasm was subtle, but Daniels caught it. His face darkened. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Marcus opened the door smoothly and stepped out. He was tall, taller than Daniels, with broad shoulders that made his suit sit sharply. For a brief moment, Daniels felt a flicker of unease, but he buried it quickly beneath arrogance. "Stand over there," Daniels barked, pointing toward the sidewalk. Marcus complied without protest, his expression calm, though his patience wore thin. He folded his hands behind his back, not because Daniels told him to, but because it was his natural stance, a position of control, of discipline. Daniels walked around the car again, peering into the windows, shining his flashlight inside, though. The daylight made it unnecessary. He asked questions rapid-fire, designed to provoke. "Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Why are you dressed like that? You got any drugs, any weapons?" Marcus answered each one with measured words, never raising his voice, never showing frustration. Inside, however, a storm brewed. He thought of all the times men like Daniels had abused their authority, how they had used the badge not as a shield of justice but as a weapon of intimidation. He thought of how easily such encounters could escalate, how quickly dignity could be stripped away. Daniels wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping low. "You know, if I wanted to, I could pull you out right now, cuff you, and drag you down to the station. No one would even ask why." Marcus met his gaze, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Is that what you want to do, officer?" he asked quietly. For a moment, Daniels hesitated. There was something in Marcus's tone that unsettled him, not fear, not defiance, but something harder to place, something like quiet authority. But his pride pushed him forward. "Don't get smart with me," Daniels snapped, though his voice carried a crack he hadn't intended. "You're not in charge here? I am." Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew something, Daniels didn't, that this entire exchange was about to turn in a way the officer could never have expected. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Daniels shifted on his feet, suddenly aware of how loud his own voice sounded against Marcus's calm silence. He was used to people cowering, apologizing, tripping over their words to appease him. But this man gave him nothing. No fear, no desperation. Just calm, steady patience. The quiet became unbearable, so Daniels filled it with more words, circling back to the same tired accusations. "You don't look like you belong here. Do people like you driving cars like this, in neighborhoods like this? It doesn't add up. So why don't you tell me the truth before I find a reason to haul you in?" Marcus took a slow breath. "The truth," he said softly, almost to himself, "has a way of revealing itself, officer. Sometimes sooner than you think." Daniels frowned, confused by the words, but unwilling to admit it. He straightened his belt, squared his shoulders again, and told himself he was still in control. But somewhere deep inside, a small, nagging unease had begun to take root. One he couldn't quite shake. The morning air was no longer quiet. The flashing lights painted the mist in red and blue, and the sound of the idling engines filled the street. A jogger slowed across the way, glancing at the scene with curiosity before hurrying on. A car passed, its driver craning their neck. To look, Daniels felt their eyes, and it only fueled his need to dominate. He wanted to show everyone watching that he was in charge, that he had authority. But Marcus stood calmly, his silence speaking louder than any words. And though Daniels didn't yet know it, that silence was about to become the thing that unraveled him completely. The air between the two men thickened with tension as the seconds dragged on. Officer Daniels stood with his hand hovering near his holster, pacing slowly like a predator circling prey. While Marcus remained composed, shoulders square, his calm demeanor unwavering. The silence was almost unbearable for Daniels, who thrived on provoking a reaction. He had built his authority not through respect but through intimidation, and when intimidation failed, he became unsettled. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "What are you waiting for? You think if you stand there long enough, I'll just let you go?" His words were sharp, but beneath them was the faint tremor of uncertainty. Marcus looked at him, steady, unblinking. "I'm waiting," he said simply, "for you to finish whatever it is you think you're doing." That answer infuriated Daniels. He wanted the man to plead, to argue, to show fear. Instead, Marcus's composure felt like an insult, as though he were the one being judged. Daniels raised his voice, his frustration bubbling over. "Don't get smart with me. Don't give the orders here. I decide when this stop is over." Marcus remained calm, though his patience was thinning. He had endured countless encounters like this, each one a reminder that the uniform on the other side of the badge wasn't always worn with honor. But there was something about this officer, the arrogance, the sneer, the way he treated authority, as a weapon that made the moment heavier, more significant. Marcus knew he would remember this stop long after it was over, and so would Daniels. Daniels pulled out his radio, pretending to check in, though he didn't really need to. It was a show, a performance for anyone who might be watching. "This is Officer Daniels conducting a stop," he said loudly, as though announcing his authority to the world. Marcus almost smiled at the absurdity of it. This was a man so desperate for power that he had to narrate his control. Minutes dragged into longer stretches, each one filled with pointless questioning. Daniels repeated himself, asking Marcus where he was going, where he came from, why he was dressed in a suit at this hour. Marcus answered each question in the same calm, measured tone, his voice steady as stone. The repetition was meant to wear him down, to break his composure. But Marcus had endured harder interrogations in his career. Finally, Marcus asked quietly, "Are you finished, officer?"
Yes.
The words were not loud, not confrontational, but they carried weight. Daniels's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "I'll decide when I'm finished. You don't tell me what to do?" Just then, the sound of another engine cut through the tension. A second police cruiser rolled up, its headlights slicing through the mist. Daniels straightened immediately, his chest puffing out as though reinforcements validated his authority. The younger officer who stepped out was fresh-faced, no more than 30, his uniform crisp, his movements quick but uncertain. He started, walking toward Daniels, but his eyes landed on Marcus, and his steps faltered. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by panic. "Sir Chief Reynolds." The younger officer stammered, his voice cracking slightly. I didn't realize it was you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniels froze, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Chief," repeated, his tone confused, almost disbelieving. The younger officer nodded quickly, his face pale. "Yes, sir. This is Marcus Reynolds, head of Internal Affairs." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniels felt the ground tilt beneath him, his chest tightening as though the very air had been sucked out of his lungs. The man he had been mocking, belittling, threatening, this wasn't just another citizen. This wasn't some stranger he could push around and forget. This was the man who held the power to decide his future. The man whose job was to investigate misconduct, corruption, abuse of power. Marcus stood exactly as he had before, his composure unchanged. Only now his silence felt different. It wasn't just patience anymore. It was authority. The calm wasn't just restraint. It was power. Daniel swallowed hard, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of realization. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I didn't realize who you were." Marcus stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "And that's the problem?" he said evenly. "You didn't care who I was. You saw my skin, you saw my car, and you decided I didn't belong. Stopped me not because I broke the law, but because you thought you could." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, looking at the ground, wishing he were anywhere else. Daniels, on the other hand, felt his world closing in. Every word Marcus spoke cut deeper, slicing through the thin veil of excuses he had always wrapped himself in. Daniels tried to recover, his voice strained. "Chief, Tit was a misunderstanding." I thought Marcus cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. "Don't lie to me. Every word you said revealed exactly what you thought. You didn't stop me because you thought I was breaking the law. You stopped me because of prejudice, and because you think the badge gives you the right to treat people like criminals without reason." Daniels's face burned with shame, though part of him still wanted to argue, to defend himself. But the words stuck in his throat, hollow and useless. He couldn't escape the truth, not now. The younger officer glanced nervously between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had heard stories of internal affairs, of the power they held. He had never expected to see it play out on the side of the road in the quiet mist of the morning. Marcus's voice softened, though it carried no less weight. "This isn't about me, Officer Daniels. It never was. This is about how you treat the people you swore to protect, about the way you use your authority. Today it happens to be me, but tomorrow it could be someone without the power to fight back. Someone who doesn't have the title I carry. And then what? Do you intimidate them? Humiliate them? Threaten them? Just because you can?" Daniels lowered his head, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. His entire career flashed before him. Every questionable stop, every moment, he had leaned on arrogance instead of justice. He had never thought anyone would hold him accountable. Not really. And yet here he was, exposed, powerless in front of the very man who could end him. Marcus studied him carefully, watching the struggle play across his face. He saw the shame, the fear, the desperation, but he also saw the arrogance still lurking beneath, the part of Daniels that wanted to dismiss this as bad luck, rather than a reflection of who he truly was. "You wear that badge?" Marcus continued, his voice steady, "but you've forgotten what it means. It's not a weapon. It's not a shield for your ego. It's a responsibility. Every stop you make, every person you speak to, you represent the law. And today, you showed me and everyone who saw this stop that you see the law as your toy. That is not just dangerous. It's unacceptable." Daniels's knees felt weak. "Please, Chief." "I didn't mean." Marcus raised his hand, silencing him instantly. "Intent doesn't erase actions, and actions have consequences." The words landed like a hammer. Daniels felt sweat gather on the back of his neck, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The younger officer shifted again, his discomfort obvious. Marcus turned slightly toward him, his expression softening just a fraction. "You saw what happened here? Remember it? Because this uniform isn't about power, it's about service. And if you forget that, you'll end up like him." The younger officer nodded quickly, his throat dry. "Yes, sir," he whispered. Marcus turned back to Daniels, who looked smaller now, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the hollow shell of a man caught in his own web. The authority he had clung to so desperately was gone, replaced with shame and fear, and Marcus knew, as he looked at him, that this stop had already changed everything. Daniels might not have understood it yet, but his career, his reputation, his very identity as an officer would never be the same again. What began as an abuse of power had turned into a Lucina, mirror held up to the man who thought he was untouchable. And now that mirror reflected the truth, stark and undeniable. The street was quiet except for the faint hum of the cruiser's engines and the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement as cars passed by. The red and blue lights flickered across the mist, staining everything with an uneasy glow. Daniels stood, frozen, his chest heaving, sweat dampening his collar, even though the air was cool. He could feel his pride unraveling thread by thread. Leaving nothing but the raw sting of exposure, Marcus remained calm, his posture straight, his presence unshaken. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to move with force. His very silence held power, the kind of power Daniels had never truly understood until now. Finally, Marcus spoke, his words deliberate, each one striking with precision, "You see? Officer Daniels," he said quietly, "internal affairs doesn't just live in paperwork. We don't just look at reports, signatures, or complaints filed. We look at behavior, we pay attention to patterns, investigate actions. And today, you have given me enough evidence in 20 minutes to understand exactly who you are behind that badge." Daniels felt the words like a knife sliding beneath armor. His throat tightened, wanted to deny it, to protest, but he knew there was no ground left to stand on. His arrogance had collapsed, leaving only desperation. "Chief." "Please," Daniels stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to salvage what was left. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just being thorough." Marcus's eyes hardened. Thorough. His tone was sharp now, edged with steel. "You call intimidation thorough? Call treating an innocent man? like a criminal thorough. Call the sneer in your voice, the hand on your weapon, the threats you made. Thorough? Daniels opened his mouth, but no sound came. The truth weighed on him heavily, crushing every excuse before it could leave his lips. He saw flashes of his career moments where he'd laughed with other officers after questionable stops, the smug satisfaction he felt when people cowered. Under his authority, the countless times he convinced himself it was part of the job. He had told himself he was maintaining order, enforcing the law. But now, in front of Marcus Reynolds, those moments twisted into ugly reflections of his own abuse. Marcus took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. His voice dropped, quiet but cutting. This uniform was never meant to be your toy. This badge was not handed to you so you could feed your ego. This boat could people need protection, because communities need trust. It's because someone has to stand when others can't. And you, he paused, his eyes locked onto Daniels' trembling face. You betrayed that trust the moment you decided the law was whatever your prejudice told you it was. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably nearby, his eyes darting between the two men. He had only been on the force a short time, still believing in the ideals they had drilled into him at the academy. Watching Daniels now was like watching a future he didn't want to inherit, a warning etched in humiliation. Daniels' knees weakened under the weight of Marcus's words. He felt smaller with each passing second. The power he once clung to now exposed as fragile, shallow, empty. Marcus straightened, his voice steady, calm again, but no less firm. I don't need to shout. I don't need to curse. I don't need to drag you away in handcuffs to make a point. All I need to do is write one report. One, and your career will be over. The sentence hit Daniels like a hammer. His badge, the very thing that defined him, that gave him the illusion of control, hung by a single thread now. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He wanted to plead, to fall on his knees, but pride still clung to him in tatters, willing to let him collapse completely. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned in, his voice softer, though no less dangerous. But ending your career isn't the point. Do you know why? Daniel swallowed hard, shaking his head slightly. His voice was gone, because if I end it, Marcus continued, you'll walk away angry, bitter. You'll tell yourself you were wronged, that the system turned on you, that it wasn't your fault. You'll carry that poison into the rest of your life. Nothing will change. You'll still be the same man, just without a badge. The words struck deeper than any threat of discipline could. Daniels felt something stir inside him, something uncomfortable, unfamiliar. A reflection he couldn't ignore. Marcus's tone sharpened again. The real punishment is this. Every time you put that uniform back on, every time you pull someone over, every time you walk into a call, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember the man you tried to humiliate. You'll remember the silence that exposed you. And you'll remember that someone was watching. Internal Affairs is always watching. Daniels' eyes burned with a mix of shame and desperation. He wanted to speak, to promise change, to beg forgiveness, but his throat locked. He had no words strong enough to bridge the gap between what he was and what he should have been. Marcus turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the younger officer, who stood rigid with discomfort. His voice softened. And you've just witnessed something you'll never forget. You've seen what happens when the badge is used for pride instead of service. Remember this moment. Let it guide you. Because the temptation will come to cut corners, to let prejudice whisper in your ear, to use authority as a weapon. But if you do, you'll end up like him. The young officer nodded quickly, his throat tight. Yes, sir, he whispered. The weight of the lesson pressing into his chest. Marcus stepped back, giving Daniels one final look. His eyes carried no hate, only a heavy disappointment. You have a choice, he said quietly. You can change. You can take this as the moment you finally see yourself clearly. Or you can ignore it, hide behind excuses, and wait for the day when your career ends because of someone else you tried to intimidate. Either way, the mirror has been placed in front of you. What you do with it is up to you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel stood still, trembling slightly, his pride gone, his future uncertain. Marcus turned without another word, walking back to his car. The mist curled around his figure as he moved, the flashing lights catching the sharp lines of his suit. He opened the driver's door, paused, and looked back one final time, his eyes locked with Daniels's, steady, unyielding. The next time, "You pull someone over, Marcus," said firmly, his voice carrying in the quiet street, "remember this moment. Remember that power isn't a weapon, it's a responsibility. Forget that again, and the consequences will be permanent." He stepped into his car, started the engine, and pulled away slowly. Leaving the scene behind, Daniels stood rooted to the ground, his badge suddenly heavy against his chest. The younger officer didn't speak, didn't move, didn't dare break the silence. The weight of what had happened pressed down on them both, but for Daniels, it was crushing. As Marcus's sedan disappeared into the fog, Daniels realized his life as he knew it was over, not because his badge would be taken today, but because the illusion he had built around it had been shattered forever. He could no longer hide from the truth of who he was. And from that day forward, every time Daniels fastened his uniform, every time he touched the metal of his badge, every time he flicked on the sirens, the memory would return. The calm gaze of Marcus Reynolds, the silence that spoke louder than threats, the realization that internal affairs was watching. Even when he thought no one could see, the stop that began with prejudice ended with a reckoning. And for Officer Daniels, it marked the beginning of the longest investigation of all, the one he would carry within himself for the rest of his life.